to make the choice that works best for their well-being and for their family's well-being. As PVA says so eloquently in their testimony, what is a more fundamental element of veterans' choice than the choice to receive quality care at home from the people they trust the most? One such veteran family I'd like to recognize here today is Kimberly Coble and her husband Scott, who depend on the Caregiver program. After facing inconsistencies and roadblocks with the program and the difficulty of recognizing mental health trauma, Ms. Cole has come here to offer her perspective. She has submitted a statement for the record outlining her suggestions for improving the Caregiver program that I encourage everyone to read, and I thank her for her work. I'd also like to thank each of the almost 300 veterans and caregivers that engaged in the VA's request for information with the intent to improve the program. I look forward to the Secretary's comments as well as the comments of the veteran service organizations, and I'm hopeful today's discussion will lead to bipartisan support and to the expansion of the program so that it may better serve veterans of all eras. This is the right and just thing to do, and we can do better. Before I close, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make a statement that Mr. Waltz can't be here today. That's why I'm sitting in this seat, but he intends to submit questions for the record. So with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Janelle, for yielding, and I'm honored, we are honored today to be joined by our first panel by the Honorable Dr. David Shulkin, Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Secretary, thank you for being here, and thank you for the incredible job you're doing for our nation's heroes. The Secretary is accompanied by Margaret Cabot, the Acting Chief Consultant for Care Management, Chaplain and Social Work Service, and Dr. Richard M. Allman, the Chief Consultant for the Geriatrics and Extended Care Service. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your service to our veterans. Mr. Secretary, you're now recognized for as much time as you may consume.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Rowe and members of the committee. And I do want to recognize Congresswoman Brownlee that Congressman Walz is not able to be here, but he's been a great steward and champion on this issue. I think that you know, I also do want to recognize the caregivers and the veterans who are with us here today. This is a really important issue, and it's one of the reasons why I always say that we have the very best committee in the House, not only because of the leadership, but because we tend to focus on the issues, and I think everybody here can agree this program is really important. It makes a difference in people's lives, and we all agree that we want to get this right, and that's what we're discussing, and the way that you all work together in a bipartisan way makes me proud and really honored to work with all of you, so thank you for that. The Caregiver program, as Congresswoman Brownlee said, started, it was passed in 2010. We began implementing it within 90 days in 2011. And what it provided was the ability for us to support caregivers and eligible veterans with training, benefits, and services. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about here today. Last year alone, we had more than 400 VA staff dedicated to this program. About 350 of them are caregiver support coordinators. They work in all of our VA medical centers, and they support about 26,000 family caregivers today. There are about 30,000 who have been served in this program since we began working it in 2011. The program includes a monthly stipend, access to health care coverage, which is so important, mental health services, again, critical, counseling, caregiver training, and respite care. I think it's important to know that VA leads the country in an unprecedented way in providing a program like this. And in every program where you're leading the way, where there's really no roadmap, we have to periodically review it and see if we can improve it, eliminate the inconsistencies on how we might be able to improve it, but also potentially expand it going forward so that we can make this valuable service accessible to other veterans and their caregivers. Last April, it became very clear to me, as both the chairman and Congressman Brownlee have mentioned, that we had inconsistencies in this program, that it wasn't working the way that we thought it should, that there were rates of revocations that were in the very, very high levels and other programs that didn't have that. And that was really unacceptable. So after I was made aware of that, I made a decision last April to pause the program in revocations. I did not want caregivers being taken away their benefits and their needed services until we could make sure that this program was working right. That pause took about 3 months, and during that time, we conducted listening sessions with our veterans and their caregivers and a number of internal and external groups, some of whom that you're going to get to hear from today. And as a result of that strategic pause, we made a whole bunch of decisions that we think improved the program. We looked at the appeals process, we put up a new website, we changed our procedures. Most importantly, we trained all of our staff across the country to have a consistent way of looking at this program. And as a result, our revocations dropped from 237 a month before the pause to 192 a month after the pause, or a 20% decrease. The last month, as the Congresswoman said, in order for us to even get more input into how we can make this program work better, and these are really additional issues for VA to take a look at, not for Congress, we published a notice in the Federal Register where we had 8 specific questions that we wanted to get feedback from people that this program matters to. And that comment period ended last night. So we're now going to start reviewing all those comments and make sure that we really understand the feedback that we're getting on how to improve the program. So this is still a work in progress. What we're trying to do is to still further improve the consistency in the caregiver program and see how we can better support family caregivers going forward. When we launched the program 7 years ago now, it was the first of its kind. It was incredibly innovative, and we have to continue to make this an innovative program that works. And in that regard, I believe we must expand caregiver support to all eligible veterans who need it. So let me say that again. I am in favor of expanding this benefit to those that are pre-9/11. So regardless of any age, regardless of when they served, this is an important program. But we have to do it in a way that's very thoughtful. We have to do it from what we've learned is working in our current program and how we can benefit those that need it most. So this is really about our fulfilling our commitment to those who have served and being good stewards to taxpayer resources. Last year, we spent about $500 million on the post-9/11 caregiver program. By expanding it to the pre-9/11 veterans, I think we can have a much bigger impact. We can do this in a cost-effective way and help those by focusing on those who need the benefit the most. And I'm not in favor of revoking this from those who currently have the benefits. I think that would be a mistake. This is about learning how we can do this better going forward. We know that as veterans age, the cost of long-term care and those with serious injuries are going to increase dramatically. And so if you take a look at the screen, we prepared a chart. This is just the blue line at the top is what we project, given our current spend, our current program, we're going to be spending in future years on long-term care services. This is mostly institutional care. Think about it as nursing home care and assisted care. But if we do the caregiver program correctly, and if we figure out the best way to help those who want to remain in their homes, we think that we can make a big difference in the cost impact of this program on taxpayers, and we think that we can improve the lives of veterans. So this is one of the reasons why we think it's important to expand this program, but do it in a thoughtful way. We know that veterans who are able to stay in their homes with caregiver support have better well-being, healing, positive outcomes, both physical and mental. For example, if we're able to change the eligibility requirement for veterans of every generation who are at the highest risk, we think we can expand caregiver support in a less costly and more cost-effective way than simply expanding it using the exact same criteria that we have now. Let me just say that the caregivers that we have are veteran spouses, but they're also parents, brothers, sisters, children of veterans, sometimes friends, neighbors, and members of the community. And they're people that know and love their veterans. That's the primary reason why we think a huge majority of veterans are better off in their homes with caregivers than the alternative. We've recently established a Caregiver Survivor Federal Advisory Committee, which just had its first meeting last October. And we're so fortunate that Senator Elizabeth Dole has agreed to chair that. This is a really important advisory committee. You all know how busy she is, so her agreeing to do that was a big deal. We've recruited lots of other distinguished members who are knowledgeable about this topic. Some of them are here with us today. We're also really excited that VA is going to be able to share our expertise and what we've learned about caregivers through the Caregiver RAISE Act, the Recognize, Assist, Include, Support, and Engage Family Caregivers Act that President Trump just recently signed into law. We know we have a lot more work to do and more decisions to make about how we can support these selfless individuals or caregivers who devote their time and life to caring for our veterans. When compiled with all this Federal Register information that we're just getting and input from our Caregiver Advisory Board, we hope we can work to provide advice to make the caregiver program better and more efficient in the future. Mr. Chairman, that includes my testimony today. We look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shulkin, for your testimony, and I'll now yield myself 5 minutes, and we're going to stick real closely to the 5 minutes because we're going to have votes at 11:30 today, so we certainly want to get through your testimony as quickly as we can. I want to begin and by also stating what you said, that I support the expansion of the program. What I would like to see us do is not a choice again, and what we talked about this before we came in. In the choice program, we had 6 ways to get non-VA care, and then we put the choice program on top of it. Right now, the VA has, the best I can understand this, and I spent a lot of time reading this in the last couple of days, is that VA does have support services, many services for pre-9/11 veterans, which include, and I'm just looking at the requests, it's about almost, it's over around $3 billion. And it's community nursing home, state home, domiciliary, state home nursing, VA community living centers, institutional obligations, adult daycare, community residence care, home hospice, home respite care, home telehealth, home-based primary care, homemaker home health aid, purchase skilled home care, spinal cord injury and disability home care, state adult day health care, VA adult day health care. Those are all programs that now are available under y'all's purview. Am I correct, for pre-9/11 veterans? And the thing that the caregiver program would have it, correct me if I'm wrong, would be the stipend and the health benefit, the CHAMP VA. Am I correct? That's really all we're talking about.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, you have it exactly right. VA provides an incredible array of services to help support veterans, particularly the pre-9/11 veterans. It's what makes VA unique. It's why when people talk about privatization of VA, they don't understand. This isn't available to outside, and so we're very proud of that. What we're talking about now is adding that one piece that's been missing for our pre-9/11 veterans, and that's caregiver support, because these caregivers are unbelievably burdened, and to provide them with what you're talking about, both a small stipend, counseling support if they need it, training, education, a caregiver support telephone line, that's what we're really talking about now.
Well, they have all of that except the stipend and the CHAMP VA. Do you have any idea about what numbers, because we missed it by 400% the last time that we did this in 2010. Do you have any numbers that might be relevant?
Yes. We think that, first of all, last time, boy, did we miss it, but we were starting a program with no experience. No one had ever done it before. Now we actually have pretty good data, and we've developed a model. If we were to simply expand it and use the exact same criteria that we do today for determining post-9/11 caregivers, we think that in 10 years we would have about 188,000 pre-9/11 caregivers. Remember, today we have 26,000, so we would expand that to 188,000 if we use the same criteria. If we used a criteria that would be a little bit more discriminatory, in other words, we use tiers, those that are in tier 3 or our most severely ill or injured veterans, we think that number would be 40,000 additional caregivers in the pre-9/11 group.
Well, it actually turned out that your estimate on the Tier 3 was pretty close. It was about 5,000
Yes.
plus, and you had estimated about 4,000. A question on the slide that you had up there,
Yes.
And I think I understand where you got your data now. You're assuming the assumption of the savings is that you will not have these folks institutionalized. Could you explain to me how or why the VA's nursing home is $400,000 per year, where I live, it's about 75. Why is it 4 times as much inside the VA as it is outside?
Well, the number that we used for that model was about $104,000 a year. And I think that that's on average how much we're paying into our state nursing homes. I think that's a better number. The 400,000 number.
Where'd that come from?
I think this is the inability of VA to separate out the overhead costs and all of the other costs associated with the VA system. The number that we feel comfortable using is 104,000. And so what you see in the delta there is the cost of all those wraparound services if we keep somebody in their home, which is about $30,000 a year less expensive than putting them into a nursing home.
Well, I'm about done, so just to hang on to this, but the question I have is, would we look at this whole package, this plethora of programs that we have, is there a way to consolidate those some so that we can use those resources in this caregiver program?
Yeah,
again, I'm out of time, so I'm going to yield to Ms. Brownlee.
Yeah, if it's okay to answer, absolutely. These are all a package of services, and we have established this year what's called a moonshot, and the moonshot would be that we believe that no veteran should have to ever leave their home because of one of these severe illnesses or injuries if they don't want to, if they want to remain in their home. And the way we would accomplish that by setting that as our goal is through this whole wraparound series of services to support somebody in their home, including caregiver support, but not duplicating. There shouldn't be duplication of those programs.
Yield now 5 minutes to Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really do want to associate myself with your comments that I believe, you know, as we did in terms of community care, we had all these different programs and then we laid choice on top of it. We shouldn't be doing the same thing here, that there are resources. The key, though, is that veterans, pre or post, have the choice. And I think in most instances, the veteran will choose in-home care because they're with the people that they trust, and that gives them the very best quality of life. And Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you making it very clear in your statement that all veterans from every era, pre and post 9/11, should receive caregiver services if they need it. So I agree that it's inequitable to the way we're approaching this. My concern is, and when you talk about the moonshot, my concern is, like, when are we going to get there? Because I don't want to study this to death. I think, you know, we're pretty clear, despite some of the flaws in the program, that it's a successful program. There's high veteran satisfaction with the program. It's clear that there's a cost savings here. And so I'm interested in knowing when, and if you can give us a timeline in terms of when we can rectify this inequity and move forward with a program that we know serves our veterans well and properly.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to do this very short. As you know, when the act passed in 2010, it required the secretary to come back in 2 years to give a recommendation on when we could expand this to the pre-9/11. That was a difficult challenge back then because of the cost of expanding this program. I think we're seeing that same issue here. And what we want to try to do, working with you and working with the Senate, is to try to figure out, is there a way to learn what we have experienced in the past to design this program so it really does what we want it to do and get on with expanding it. The Senate has this included in their version, and I think that there's an opportunity for all of you to have a discussion about that. We'd like to participate in that discussion to help design this program well. I think the key point, if I had to boil it down to one issue, Congresswoman, it is that every one of the programs the chairman mentioned, the home care, the respite, the aid and attendance program, the homemaker program, all uses a clinical criteria of 3 activities of daily living. The caregiver program uses 1 activity of daily living. So if we could get some consistency on clinical criteria, and reasonable people can discuss this, that's why we put it in the Federal Register. We want to hear everybody's thoughts. But if we could come up with consistency, we think we could expand this program. It's the right thing to do, but let's do it in a clinically appropriate way.
So consistency is the barrier in terms of moving ahead on this? That's the only barrier?
I think
From
it's...
your perspective?
Yes.
I'd really like it if you could give us a firmer timeline.
Oh.
So if that's what we need to do to give that to you, fine. But if we give that to you, then what do you see as the time frame?
As soon as you guys pass a law on this, giving us the authority to do it, we'd like to see it with clinically appropriate criteria to do it in the right way. But this is really your decision. The Senate and the House have to come to agreement on this.
Okay. So in terms of, moving forward here in the short term, I think you've sort of laid out in your testimony some of the areas that need to be fixed. We've just talked about consistency, but it's also IT and a number of other things, number of caregiver support coordinators, properly trained, et cetera. Can we expect to see a request for full funding for the caregiver programs to address these issues from the administration?
We currently have in the upcoming budget a request for continuing the current caregiver program. Once we were to have authority to expand.
I'm not talking about expansion right now. I'm talking about the issues that need to be addressed. That's going to cost some money, whether it's IT, whether it's additional training, whether it's more supervisors. Is that included in the budget request?
I think it is, but let's have Meg, who runs the program, tell us.
Yes, the current budget request does reflect all that we need to do. There was some substantial growth early on. The numbers were doubling in 2015, 2016, and we've seen really a steadying of the current need. We've been averaging about 24,000 for the past 2 years, so we don't have that huge increase that we need because about 80% of our budget is the stipend payments that go to caregivers.
Thank you. I need to yield back. I have more follow-up questions, but I know we're on a strict timetable. I apologize.
General Bergman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Dr. Shulkin and the rest of you for being here. I'm a Marine. I'm pretty simple. You know that. We've talked before. Ready, aim, fire. Okay? Not ready, fire, aim. You're asking us to fire before I've heard you aim. Does the VA have the ability, because Dr. Shulkin, I heard you say that the inability of the VA to do something, does the VA, as it's currently structured with the people on board assigned to this task, do they have the ability to assess what has worked and what has not worked already with the population that we had, the post-9/11 veterans?
Yeah, I believe that we do. I believe, at least it's my belief, that we do not right now have consistency of the clinical criteria, and it would be my recommendation that we fix that so that this program can be targeted to those that would get the most benefit from it. But Dr. Allman is our clinical chief, and so do you feel like we know enough about how to fix this?
Yes, Secretary Shulkin, I think we do indeed have we have field expertise and field expertise within.
Can you put a cost? So what the criteria you've developed to fix this, Because in your graph, you're obviously going to take the savings. You're counting on the savings from expanding the program, okay? Can you take the criteria that you have developed to fix the program, can you attach a dollar figure to them now?
Well, the estimate that we had was that by 2030, I believe, we would be saving about, or cost avoiding, $2.5 billion. Clearly, the cost is going up.
But it's one thing to cost avoid. It's another thing to you're going to have to hire clinicians. If we change the clinical criteria and tighten up all the specs and standards, are you able to tie a cost to that?
I think we have the staff, the people with the ability to carry out this program. If Congress gives the ability for us.
How long is it going to take to, the public comment just closed at midnight. How long is it going to take to assess the responses and the data that you've gotten from that public comment? How long?
Mm-hmm. So we have staff who've been collecting the data as we go through. As with other Federal Register notices, there are many comments that do not respond directly to the questions. In fact, about a third of them are very short and state that
how long is it going to take
for us to go through all those comments?
Yeah.
Well, we're already. I expect it to take about six to 8 weeks to get to the point where we can identify some specific recommendations. Now, those recommendations are about our current program. They are not about.
That's okay. That's okay. It's taking the data that you've asked for and assessing the data and then applying it to what we're going to move forward to try to accomplish. Because what you're asking us to do is to put more money into an unproven program. I'm a pilot. Mm-hmm. I've done experimental aircraft flying and all of those kinds of things. You don't put an aircraft into service until you know that it is safe to fly. And I would suggest to you the same thing with this program. Not only number one criteria is to make sure whether we expand the program or not, and by the way, I support expanding the program, is that we have to ensure that it works for our veterans. And I get a little antsy at times not seeing the data to support whatever clinical criteria is the why of what we're doing. And I guess because I know my time's going to run short here, has over the last few years in our attempt to provide this home care to the post 9/11 veterans, has that increased the size of the VA bureaucracy?
We have about 400 staff working on this program now.
Did we hire new to do that?
Yes.
So we created 400 more positions to do this. Okay. I know my time is running short here. I'm just going to yield back to 30 seconds because we're behind schedule.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Tacano, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in your pre-hearing question responses, you suggested that to expand the Caregivers program, you would need legislative authority. You reiterated that position in your answer to Ms. Brownlee's question. But in the past, you have suggested that you could expand the Caregiver program under your own authority. You've made public statements to that effect. Can you clarify your position?
Well, I think that we do need additional legislative authority and appropriations to be able to expand to the pre-9/11 population. I believe the 2010 Act was for post-9/11 veterans.
But you've made prior public statements to the effect that you believe that you could expand this program under your current authority as Secretary.
Yeah, I think that
were you in error? Were those erroneous statements?
I think that what I was trying to say was not on the legal legislative issue, but that if we have the right consistency of clinical criteria, that would allow us to take current resources and expand them to veterans who need them of any age.
So by adjusting these criteria, you do have the authority to expand the caregiver to pre-9/11 recipients.
Let's try to clarify this because I don't want to have a confusion.
So I think it's important to note that there are all kinds of different programs that provide support to caregivers. Dr. Rowe mentioned many that provide home and community-based services. We also within
Excuse me, I just want to cut in. I just want to get a straight answer about your authority.
So
I just heard the Secretary say that if he were to adjust the criteria, that he does have the authority to expand the caregiver program to pre-9/11 individuals.
We do not have the authority to provide stipends directly to...
Wait a minute, you're now parsing words about stipends. Do you have the authority or do you not?
It's the program of comprehensive assistance within the caregiver support program. We do not have the authority
Or
to
comprehensive, but
Correct.
if you were to adjust the criteria, you could.
other services, but not the program of
I'm taking your answers
assistance.
that, I mean, you have made previous public statements to the effect that you could, Mr. Secretary. You have added that if you adjust the criteria that you can. So you do have a certain amount of discretion to expand under your own authority right at this moment the program. I just want to know whether the White House, the budget director, or any other person in this administration has put undue pressure on you to change the tune here.
No. I apologize that there is confusion, but I think that right now there shouldn't be confusion. What the comprehensive caregiver program, we cannot expand that to pre-9/11 veterans without legislation. We provide a number of services to older veterans, but not this particular program.
Okay, and the key word is comprehensive.
Yes.
You are able to offer less than comprehensive services.
Yes.
Okay. In your response to pre-hearing questions from this committee, you discussed the cost of expanding eligibility to pre-9/11 veterans. In the response, you suggest it could be as much as $3 billion annually. In the past, CBO has suggested such expansion would cost $3.4 billion over 5 years. And just last year, before this committee, you suggested the CBO score, quote, was not an accurate reflection on the true cost because I believe we are going to save money, but not by institutionalizing people, end quote. Can you please explain the discrepancy between your estimate and that of past CBO scores?
Well, the CBO came up with the score on the Senate bill. I think you're right. I think it was about $3.4 billion over was it a 10-year period?
It's 5 years.
5-year period.
Because that particular legislation rolls in eligibility.
And what I have said in the past, and that's what we showed the slide, is that I do believe that if you create the right criteria and consistency of criteria with our other programs, that there will be cost savings that CBO did not consider.
All right. I appreciate that response. The other questions I have to submit are going to make me run over time, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Vice Chair, Mr. Billaracis, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for your outstanding work on behalf of our America's heroes. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank the staff for being here as well. I also want to thank you for your quick response with regard to our veterans at Bay Pines. I appreciate that so very much. Mr. Secretary, I have a couple questions. Do you have a legislative proposal to improve or expand the program?
The current law has the criteria of one activity of daily living in the law, so it does not give us the ability to change that criteria. Okay,
can we work with you on a legislative proposal?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's very important to us. Again, we want to make sure we get that as soon as possible to Congress, and we want to work together to get this done, because I am also a supporter of the pre-9/11 veterans, that they need the care. And also, I have a proposal, a concept, a hero's ranch concept that I'd like to discuss with you as well.
Okay.
Again, the veterans should have a choice. But if they don't have the caregiver available, qualified caregiver, I don't want to see them in a nursing home. So again, it's a quality of care issue. All right, couple questions here. Again, in your testimony, you mentioned that VA heard concerns about the inconsistent implementation of the program, which led to the strategic review in April 2017. What were the immediate actions that were taken in response to those concerns?
We looked at the policies and procedures and refined them. We then went out and did training for all 350 caregiver support coordinators across the country. We met with caregiver groups and their families and veterans and talked to them about the program. We published a new website which had clarity on it. And when we rolled it out, there was greater consistency in decision-making, as evidenced by a 20% reduction in revocations around the country.
Okay. I've heard from stakeholders in my district that there are still inconsistencies in communication and process with regard to the clear eligibility requirements. Why has effective communication between VA and caregivers about eligibility been such a challenge for this program? Again, I hear from constituents on a regular basis.
Well, I think what we're learning is you can never communicate enough, and we just have to constantly be working at doing this better. One of the reasons why I established a Family Caregiver Advisory Committee was exactly for this. How do you find better ways to communicate? How do we find better ways to hear the feedback? And that committee, as I mentioned, met for the first time in October. Senator Dole chairs it. And I think we're learning a lot from that, exactly how to do a better job with communication.
Yeah, and we want to assist in getting the word out as well.
Yeah.
So please include us.
Thank you.
Again, how many enrolled caregivers have been disqualified or removed from the program? And again, for what reasons?
Yeah. It's currently now at about 192 a month, so we're probably on a run rate of 1,500 a year, just trying to do the math quickly. And the reasons why are, the good reasons why would be because the veteran has gotten better and doesn't need the services, doesn't meet the criteria. That would be the good reason. The bad reason would be because the initial decision wasn't the appropriate one. And so in these evaluations, which are done in multidisciplinary teams, they're coming up with these decisions. And we give the family and the veteran or the caregiver the right to appeal it, because we don't always get the revocations right. That's why I paused it. And I agree with what you're hearing. We still have a ways to go to make this program work better.
Okay, how long does it take, maybe the application, on the average, maybe somebody else can answer this question, Ms. Kabat, on the average, how long does it take, the application process and the appeals process? Because that's very important as well.
So about 85% of our applications are approved or denied within 120 days. And really, we have just a handful of sites who are not in that group. So we have targeted a lot of intervention and support and assistance to those particular sites who are struggling with that timeliness beyond the average for the other sites.
Yeah, we've got to do better. Again, time is of the essence. So thank you very much again for thinking outside the box, Mr. Secretary, and again, putting our veterans first. Appreciate it very much. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ms. Esty, recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Rowe, and to the ranking member for holding today's hearing. I am one of the sponsors of and authors of an expansion bill. And I appreciate your coming here today, and I really want to thank the VSOs who have been very strongly in favor of this, advocating for veterans and their families for equity and parity and recognizing. And I will tell you, mine is one of those districts with a lot of Korea and World War II veterans, with aging caregivers who have been doing this for decades. And frankly, I think it's unfair and unwise not to give them the support and assistance that they deserve to have, particularly at this time. So I appreciate with your focus, but I want to drill down on what that really looks like. Dr. Shulkin, you've talked about Tier 3. So I want you to do two things. Can you discuss what Tier 3 is? And I want you to answer this question. Are you suggesting, or do you think we should be restricting the post-9/11 to Tier 3? If you had your druthers, if you were talking about the best way to serve, would you recommend, is that what you are suggesting, that we focus on those most in need, and the expansion should not be by era, but the expansion should be by severity? Because that's a really important thing for us to discuss with limited resources, and I think in fairness to veterans and their families, they should understand what exactly you would be calling on us to do, because if we're going to look to expand to those most severely, that's a really important distinction. We would have to authorize that here in Congress.
Absolutely.
And I want to get my handle around that, and it's not clear to me that if that's only for one era, why would you not be actually asking us for all areas? Thank you.
Right. Well, no, thank you. And what I'm doing is just giving you my best advice because this is your decision. I do believe that, first of all, we should not be removing caregiver support from people who have already been granted that benefit. So I am not suggesting revocations. But moving forward, if we were to expand, I believe that my recommendation would be to move towards criteria that would be Tier 3, which is 3 activities of daily living or cognitive dysfunction. Cognitive dysfunction would be a separate category. And the reason why I say that, and Dr. Allman's here as the expert, is that every other one of our programs uses 3 activities of daily living as the criteria. The state Medicaid programs in your states that offer caregiver services use 3 ADLs as their criteria. Medicare uses for nursing home determinations 3 ADLs. So if we want consistency, I believe, and the best use and impact in an area of not unlimited resources, I believe that would be my best recommendation. But I do not support withdrawing services from those who have already been granted them.
And could you repeat again for us your best estimate if we were to do expansion to all areas?
Well, we
of
have
how many would be Tier 3? I know you talked a little bit about what those numbers are.
We have about 26,000 now that are post 9/11, and we would have approximately 40,000 pre 9/11.
And the savings on the chart that you showed us, those savings are predicated on the assumption that those Tier 3 veterans would otherwise be in a much more expensive institutionalized setting that would in fact be paid for by taxpayers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is that assuming some of those are in VA facilities and some are in other facilities?
Yes. Yeah, community nursing homes, state nursing homes, and VA facilities. Yes.
Okay. And are those assumptions over the chart you're looking at, is that based on inflation rates that we have seen in nursing homes?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I mean, it's a very important question.
No, that's a good question.
Dr. Ullman?
Yes. Best we can, but you're right, they've been climbing pretty high. Yeah.
Is that correct, Dr. Alsman? Do you know if that's projecting out what we have seen
the
over
numbers
the last
were
10
adjusted
years?
for inflation, and so they're in $20-30.
But based on the inflation rate for nursing homes or on the general inflation rate? Because those are two very different rates.
Just the general inflation rate, as I
So that could well be much higher than that. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. Mr. Rutherford, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for everything that you have been working very hard to do to improve medical care for our veterans. I know how much they appreciate that. I'd like to first begin with a request. Could I get some of the backup data for the chart that we have up here? Because one of the things that I'm a little confused about, I did a little math here, and Tier 1, with these stipends, just the stipend amount, is $4.5 million. Tier 2 is $11.8 million, and Tier 3 is $12.9 million, for a total of $29.2 million. And there's a delta on the chart of $2 million, but I don't know what that represents. Can we get the backup data for that to make sense of that?
The very easy math, but we absolutely will get you the model, is we're using a nursing home costs $104,000 a year, and these wraparound services that the chairman talked about, including caregivers, about $30,000 a year less than that.
So a $74,000 delta?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd love to see
we'll get you that.
Thank you. And so my next question is it true that, as the testimony from the Elizabeth Dole Foundation claims, that individual visitors have the autonomy to run the family caregiver program as they see fit? Is anybody addressed that comment?
No, that's not accurate. As Dr. Rose said, we published a directive, which is the national policy that all VISNs are required, all medical centers are required to follow. We have a lot of different ways that we provide oversight from the national office, including site visits, as well as some data analytics. So certainly I'll follow up with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation about that specific comment.
Good, thank you. Also, when we established the graduated tier system, did that complicate the execution of this program by actually bringing more people in than we originally anticipated, or Congress anticipated?
I think that having the three different tiers is very difficult and confusing. It's confusing for caregivers and veterans. Mm-hmm. We did our best in establishing a tool that's used by VA clinicians, and now we are, by the end of this year, we'll have actually 90% of our sites using a multidisciplinary approach, mm-hmm. because it is so very complicated, not just the eligibility, but also establishing that tier level.
Right, and I think the eligibility issues that Mr. Secretary, that you talked about is, when you look at Tier 3, that's pretty much what everybody had projected, and then it turned out to be something completely different. Let me ask this: should the determination of eligibility for stipend payments be restricted only to those caregivers giving the 40 hours of treatment in Tier 3, understanding that all of these other programs are available for caregivers who may only be spending 10 hours a week. That doesn't seem like a lot of time, and yet they have a lot of opportunity to get assistance through these other programs. What's your opinion on that, I guess?
Do you have a thought on that?
I think it's certainly caregiving occurs on a continuum. At one end, you have a family member that you may start calling twice a day because you're concerned about them, way up to the high levels of care in which a caregiver is providing a lot more than 40 hours of support a week, and including special diets, tube feeding, all of those kinds of things. And we really want to be able to provide support to every caregiver along that entire continuum. And I think the key is where we target the comprehensive assistance. We need to make sure that we continue to provide all the other kinds of supports that we have, the wraparound services, training and education, all of those things, but to determine where that line is, where we move to that comprehensive group.
Okay. Well, my time is up, but I would like to go on record. I support expansion of the program, but I think, as General Bergman said, we really need to do this in a smart way.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. And Ms. Rice, you recognize they have called votes, so we'll get through yours, and then we'll have to come back. I apologize.
No problem.
Secretary Shulkin, very quickly, caregiver assistance is one of the biggest issues that comes up in my district, as I'm sure everyone on this panel will say. Mm-hmm. And so I would just like to reiterate what my colleague, Mr. Bilirakis, was saying in terms of doing the outreach to have them understand exactly what they need to do in order to avail themselves of these services. So I appreciate your focus on that. Forgive me if I missed this. Were you able to figure out a dollar figure in terms of the savings that because the VSOs have well documented the savings, obviously, and you have testified here today about keeping people out of facilities and in their home.
Save upwards of $2.5 billion by 10 years, probably about half of that by 5 years.
And that has got to be done legislatively.
That would have to be done legislatively.
So just one last question. The Elizabeth Dole Foundation pointed out that the VA has taken several steps to address the persistent inconsistencies with implementing and operating the caregiver program at the regional, local level, but that the program still lacks a level of centralization. I'm just curious, Mr. Secretary, what steps you're taking to kind of centralize that as requested?
Well, I shared that same concern, which is why I paused the program in April this year. I said no more revocations until we're sure we have program oversight. Meg Cabot, that leads it, was responsible for telling me when she was ready to start the program up again with the appropriate program oversight. And we believe we have good program oversight now, a consistent directive. Is it perfect? No, but it's a lot better than it was.
So I lied. One quick question. If you, I totally support your position that there shouldn't be any revocations to people who currently have qualified for this service. Right. Going forward, though, if we were to make this legislative fix, they would not suffer. The people who already have it would not suffer. And
we would continue to support those that are eligible under the current criteria. I don't think you can just pull the wool out of people that you've already made a commitment to.
Right.
But we also have a commitment to the pre-9/11 veterans. I think everybody in this room so far has been in agreement with that. And so the issue is whether we would just continue our current criteria or whether we would accept industry standards for criteria and adopt new ones going forward. And, that would be my recommendation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Dr. Winstrup, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick, multifaceted question, I guess, but if you could explain the purpose of the family caregiver monthly stipend, the purpose of the aid and attendance benefits, sort of the difference between the two, and should one offset the other? Yeah.
That's a great question. I'm going to, Meg's more familiar.
Sure. So the stipend is paid directly to the family caregiver. That is one significant difference, because aid and attendance is additional money that's in the veteran's compensation or pension check, because that veteran requires the, quote, aid and attendance of another person. In neither circumstance is there any requirement to use the funds in any specific way. There's no oversight of how those funds are being used. Historically, the aid and attendance benefit, I think there is language around that talks about getting assistance in order to remain at home, but there's no tracking of that goes on. So the difference is really who receives the money.
So might they be compensating for the same care?
Well, the stipend, as the comprehensive assistance program, was really money that was paid directly to caregivers in recognition of the sacrifices that they had made. It was not meant to be income replacement or anything like that.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
We will adjourn until after votes, and again, I apologize.
So does that mean that they come back and
Yeah.
take care of
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They're going to come back.
gavel the meeting back to order. And just a couple of things as members make their way back to the dais. First of all, I thought our first, before the interruption, was extremely helpful to me to focus where this program is going, could, and should become. And I think one of the things that you pointed out, Mr. Secretary, was that if we would apply the Tier 3 eligibility criteria, the same as other different agencies do, you narrow it down to those most in need. I think we need to work on the IT part. A phase-in for people who might be going to nursing home care would be first in the queue. I think if we do those things and we get a better estimate of what the cost, I think that's something that we could carry to the Congress and get passed. I really believe it is. So have I pretty well summarized what your thoughts are on this?
You have, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Mr. O'Rourke, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. Thanks for being here. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for convening this hearing. I know that every time we have a joint House-Senate listening session with the veteran service organizations, this is at the top of the agenda. And so I love the fact that we're trying to make some progress on it, and I appreciate the Secretary's effort and focus and attention on this. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions about eligibility going forward for pre-9/11 veterans and caregivers. You mentioned that under one scope of the program, you could have up to 188,000 pre-9/11 caregivers, and under a more restricted scope, you could have just 40,000. I wanted to get your thoughts about what happens to those other 148,000 caregivers if they're not eligible for this program. And then you may want to in your answer, talk about you're trying to harmonize with other eligibility criteria for Medicaid, for example. You may also want to think about Department of Defense, which I think has a more expansive set of eligibility requirements, and maybe talk about how we take care of those other 148,000 families.
Yeah. No, thank you, Congressman. First of all, it is very confusing when all these different departments, all that work for the same employer, the federal government, have different eligibility criteria. So it would be, I think we'd be doing a service to move towards what's a reasonably clinically appropriate criteria across the board. The difference between the 40,000, let's talk about the Tier 3, and the 188,000, which was the projection if we use the current criteria of one ADL, the 148,000 that you talk about, they are eligible for all of the other services that the chairman had mentioned. They're eligible for home care visits, primary care directed visits, assistance with respite care, general caregiver support services, just not the comprehensive program.
So just to, I just want to make sure I understand apples to apples, would not be eligible for caregiver stipend, caregiver counseling and mental health services, caregiver medical care, additional respite care, and reimbursement of travel expenses.
I think that's right. That's the comprehensive program you're talking about. But today we support 250,000 older veterans with these wraparound services. So we're really doing a lot today, but you have it correct, Congressman.
Yeah, but it excludes those. In reading some of the DoD eligibility criteria, while I don't think it explicitly describes post-traumatic stress disorder, it describes difficulty with sleep regulation, requires assistance or supervision as a result of delusions or hallucinations, difficulty with recent memory, self-regulation issues. And I'm concerned, and I'm sure you are as well, that if we too narrowly constrain eligibility, we'll be missing the opportunity to help pre-9/11 veterans and their caregivers deal with very serious issues. You're the first Secretary that I know of who has made reducing veteran suicide a priority. We know 20 a day will take their lives today, every day, until we get a handle on this. And I believe the largest cohort are not post-9/11 GI post 9/11 veterans. It is pre 9/11. I think it's the Vietnam era of service. So if we're going to exclude them from eligibility and the caregivers in their lives from this kind of help, what will happen to them?
Well, first of all, one of the criteria that we would propose, besides the 3 ADLs, is any type of cognitive dysfunction. So that would absolutely need to be in there. Secondly, today our caregiver program has a very high incidence of mental health issues and post-traumatic stress. 89% of our current 26,000 caregivers in the comprehensive program have a comorbidity, and a high percentage of them mental health. So we're very sensitive to that, and I do think this fits in with providing as much support as possible to help reduce not only suicide, but also the burden of mental illness and mental health issues.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Poliquin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Shulkin, it's always good to see you. Thank you very much for being here, and please continue. I know you will, your great work for our veterans. My questions, sir, relate to the post-9/11 veterans that are currently eligible for the program. Mr. Shulkin, my parents are 89 and 87, and they live in a little apartment in an assisted living place, and we need additional home care help for my mom, who's a retired nurse, so she gets it. My father's a little bit stubborn, but he gets it. She gets it. We all know how vitally important it is to keep our seniors, our veterans, at home as long as we can, such that they can recover fully and keep them out of hospitals and out of other medical facilities. So this is a great program that I completely support, especially in rural parts of Maine where you don't have access. And I know you were up at Brewster County not long ago, and we don't have a lot of options up there. You know, if you're one of our great heroes and you're missing a limb, it's very different from helping take care of mom and dad. But they need to learn how to dress and walk and shower and cook and all these other things. So I'm very, very supportive of this program. However, I'm also mindful, Mr. Shulkin, that you might not have been here for this hearing. It was last October. There was a terrific veteran, one of our great heroes, named Brendan O'Byrne, and I quote, "Being an active member of society is the ultimate sign of healing from combat, and we should all be striving for it," end quote. So my question to you, and where I want to go down this path, if I may, Mr. Secretary, is I know this program is designed to be temporary, to help our veterans adjust to their new situation, showing them compassion to help them adapt and get back onto a regular routine, and also for their caregivers to move on with their normal lives. So I want to make sure, or I rather want to ask you the question, sir, is this goal, as Mr. O'Byrne testified, to get back to an independent living and what have you, is that the goal of this program?
Well, I think that should be the goal of all of our programs at VA, our benefits program and our health programs, to restore independence. That's what people want. Sometimes, of course, that's not going to be possible. And I think that is the reason why you should separate out high need people from those that can get on a program towards independence, and then reevaluate whether people need the continued support.
Mm-hmm. Can you list, rather, any specific reforms to the program right now that may help to that end?
Yeah. Some of the things we did in our strategic pause, I'm sure.
Sure. One thing we did was we instituted something that we call a roles and responsibilities document. It's on our website. We wanted to make sure that we were being transparent about it, and it really describes what the requirements of the program are, and also helps our caregiver support coordinators start the conversation that you're describing about, for some of our veterans, this is an intervention that may be short-lived. Mm-hmm. While the caregiver is receiving additional supports, that comprehensive assistance, the veteran is also going to be receiving mental health treatment or occupational physical therapy, so that as that veteran increases their level of independence, the amount of that comprehensive assistance that the caregiver receives will decrease. So that has been a significant change in our program. We actually required that all of our caregiver support coordinators commissioners go back and review that same document with all of our current participating as well as any new participating.
Can you, Dr. Shulkin, comment on any potential obstacles that you're facing at the VA with respect to achieving this goal that we can help you with?
Well, I want to get the clinical criteria correct. I mean, I think that that having different clinical criteria between these multiple programs is confusing and doesn't allow us to focus on those that need it the most.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ms. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Shulkin, God bless you, sir. Thank you for your leadership. You continue to provide encouraging testimony. Many of us in this committee have been advocates for expanding the caregiver program to pre-9/11 veterans for quite some time. For me, that's a year since day one on this committee. And I'm sensing a path forward, here. So let us forge forward and perhaps arrive at a bipartisan conclusion that we can make this thing happen. But let me just state that even in a world of unlimited resources and funding, would we not want to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse?
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. So given the additional dynamic where we certainly do not live in a world of unlimited funding and resources, should we not seriously investigate waste, fraud, and abuse where it does exist in the stipend program, the caregiver program for post-9/11 veterans, whereby that funding may be made available for deserving veterans pre-9/11? Would you concur with that general assessment?
Absolutely.
Okay, given that, how often are receivers of stipends supposed to be visited in some sort of a supervisory role of a VA employee to go to their home and observe their home and interview that subject?
Yeah.
Isn't that supposed to be quarterly?
Yeah.
Yes, it is quarterly. Now,
And what's the reality, though?
I don't have exact numbers. I can get back to you on the reality of that. That is something that we've really focused on. And many caregivers are concerned that that's too frequent. And so we have allowed in certain circumstances, and I can provide you with those criteria, where that wouldn't be an in-person visit, but it would be telehealth or over the telephone. There is a requirement for an annual in-home, in-person visit, however.
But there are caseworkers assigned to individual veterans.
Correct.
The 46,000 number, they have corresponding.
Yeah, we have 350 caregiver coordinators for 26,000.
I'm sorry, for 26,000.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Well, this particular program is just generally known to be rife with abuse. And can you imagine? I mean, viewed from the prism of a soldier, can you imagine a soldier having, a full vest, 10 magazines for his M4, and his fellow soldier having 1 magazine? Can you imagine any soldier that would not give his fellow soldier a few magazines from his
No, sir.
From his vest? Sure, of course we would. So it's troubling that waste, fraud, and abuse even exists, and it's disheartening that it exists within a veteran population, but it does. And in order for us to move forward as a body, can we seek your commitment, sir, that there will be a genuine effort to seek out unrighteous abuse of this program, whereby that funding can be made available to the righteous, deserving veterans pre-9/11? And may I ask, Madam, is social media used? If you have a veteran posting pictures of him hitting in the gym, deep sea fishing, snow skiing, etc., he can probably feed himself and bathe himself.
So is your question, do we review social media?
Yes.
We do not currently review social media. We rely on an interdisciplinary approach made up of physicians, nurses, social workers, occupational physical therapy, mental health professionals.
As it should be, because a veteran's privacy should be completely preserved and respected. However, we do live in an era of social media, and this is available data. So if you have a staffing issue that's causing us not to be able to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse, might I suggest that that social media perhaps could be an avenue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I would like to thank this first panel for your instructions. Been very helpful. I will add to you, as a matter of fact, it cleared up a lot of things about how I think we can see a way forward. I thank all three of you for being here, and I apologize for the votes that came up in the middle. We couldn't help that, and with that, you all are dismissed. I know you've got a busy day ahead of you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Joining us will be our second panel as soon as the Secretary is able to leave. Joining us, excuse me, on our second panel this morning is Adrian Edizano, the Deputy National Legislative Director for Disabled American Veterans. Welcome. Sarah Dean, the Associate Legislative Director for Paralyzed Veterans of America. Also welcome. And Stephen Schwab, the Executive Director of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Edizano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I want to thank you for inviting DAV to testify on the VA Caregiver Program. Since its inception several years ago, VA's Comprehensive Caregiver Support Program has been annually serving over 20,000 caregivers of severely injured veterans. And there is mounting evidence that the program is measurably supporting and improving the lives of family caregivers and their veterans. According to an online caregiver survey DAV conducted last year, more than 3/4 of disabled veterans who currently rely on family caregivers would require institutional care now or in the near future if their loved one could no longer be their family caregiver. Here's what one of the caregivers we surveyed, a 38-year-old mother with teenage children who's caring for her severely disabled husband, said, quote, "We depend on the caregiver program more than you can imagine. I miss doing what I love, my career, but I love my husband and my children. My husband depends on me in so many ways that there are days when I am just so exhausted, but I continue on because I know he needs me." Mr. Chairman, we are grateful that the committee is holding today's hearing to examine how to improve and expand VA's Comprehensive Caregiver Support Program. And we offer a few recommendations on how to improve the program in our written testimony. However, there is no issue more important today than finally correcting the gross unfairness and inequity that discriminates against veterans ill and injured prior to September 11, 2001, and their family caregivers. In the audience today are DAV past National Commander Dennis Joyner and his wife and caregiver Donna, and DAV past National Commander Dave Riley and his wife and family caregiver Yvonne. I would please ask that they raise their hands to be recognized. Thank you. Now, Mr. Chairman, last time Dennis walked was on patrol in Vietnam's Mekong Delta on June 26, 1969. And he has been confined to a one-arm drive wheelchair ever since. While he led a successful and rewarding career, it was greatly aided by the love, work, and sacrifice of his wife, Donna. When his one good shoulder, finally gave out a decade ago, Donna was forced to resign from her full-time job to be his full-time caregiver. But because Dennis was injured in Vietnam, Donna isn't eligible for VA's Comprehensive Caregiver Program. Now for Dave, after losing his arms and legs 2 decades ago during his service in the Coast Guard as a rescue swimmer, each and every day begins and ends with the help and love of his wife and full-time caregiver, Yvonne. Despite the considerable progress Dave has made functioning with his prosthetic limbs, as a quadruple amputee, he will always rely on Yvonne for the many of his basic needs. Like Dennis and Donna, Dave and Yvonne are not eligible because he too is a pre-9/11 veteran. But even if the date were changed, Mr. Chairman, Dave and Yvonne would likely not be allowed access to VA's comprehensive caregiver program because he lost his limbs to a waterborne flesh-eating bacteria. It would be an illness and not an injury, and the law doesn't count illnesses. Mr. Chairman, the most critical reform for the caregiver program is extending eligibility to severely disabled veterans from World War eras. Research has shown that family caregivers delay, avoid, and in certain situations can actually help transition veterans out of nursing homes at great cost savings to taxpayers. The Congressional Budget Office estimated to extend access to pre-9/11 veterans is about $30,000 a year. Compare this to an average annual cost of over $400,000 for a VA nursing home or $110,000 for a community nursing home for disabled veterans. Respecting a severely disabled veteran's choice to remain in their homes longer is not only economically smart, making more efficient use of VA and taxpayer funds, but it also allows a veteran to lead high-quality lives with respect and dignity and be an active member of society. After a lifetime of caregiving, Gulf, Vietnam, Korean, and World War II veterans, many family caregivers are aging, and their ability to continue in their role is declining. With bipartisan support in the Senate, a growing support in the House, we believe now is the time to act. Mr. Chairman, DAV, along with virtually all the VSOs, call on this committee to take bold action, similar to what the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee did last fall. Pass legislation to expand eligibility for VA's program to veterans severely ill and injured from all eras and their family caregivers. This concludes my testimony. Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dean, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Congresswoman Brownlee, and members of the committee, Paralyzed Veterans of America thanks you for the opportunity to present our views before you today. We are grateful for your interest in the improvements and potential expansion of the caregiver program. No group better understands the value of caregivers more than PVA's members, veterans with spinal cord injuries or diseases. And most of PVA's members currently do or will rely on a caregiver. 7 years ago, the VA stood up a program that was the first of its kind in the United States. Recognizing the degree of injury endured by service members returning home and the burden shouldered by their caregivers, Congress took bold action to enable VA to meet their needs. Based on the clinical determination of activities of daily living or need for supervision, the caregivers of certain veterans receive comprehensive critical supports to provide quality care at home. For PVA members who are eligible, this program has enabled them and their families to better manage the new normal of their lives. The feedback we receive is that the program has been crucial, has given caregivers the tools to manage the emotional, physical, and financial stresses of caring for someone with a severe disability. As with any unique program, especially one of this scale and this integrated a reach, challenges were encountered. But overall, and especially after the corrective actions of last summer, it is our belief that VA has done a commendable job addressing these issues, and we see no reason why Congress should not take bold action again and enable VA to meet the needs of the majority of veterans who rely on caregiver services, those catastrophically injured on or before September 10th, 2001. PVA understands the costs associated with any expansion are significant, and there likely will never be a projection that isn't. But as has been stated, not expanding will have considerable costs. We know that veterans who remain home receive a quality of life that they can't get in an institution. And we know that supported caregivers reduce hospital admissions and medical complications. In recent years, this room has seen a lot of discussion about veterans' choice and care in the community. This committee, for nearly 4 years, has shepherded reform efforts so veterans are able to receive care that best meets their needs in and outside of VA. So I ask again, what could be more fundamental to that question, or to that conversation, than seeing that veterans are able to choose to stay home while receiving the care that best meets their needs? According to CBO, roughly 70,000 veterans who are catastrophically injured as a result of their service are in need of critical supports right now. But for 7 years, Congress has said it costs too much. That is unacceptable. This is a clinically determined program. If the cost is significant, if it's the $3.4 billion over 5 years, as the Senate projection says, then that is what we owe, because that is the deal we made when they signed up. I know of no other clinically determined support service for service-disabled veterans that cuts off access because of date and is then justified by members of Congress because of cost. It is unconscionable to tell those injured that only some of you will be helped. We are the beneficiaries of their sacrifice. They served, they were injured. We do what we have to make them as whole as possible. This program is an imperfect solution to the perfect one of wholly healing these people. But for PVA members in the program, it has made all the difference in their lives. For our older veterans who have been relying on the sacrifices of their spouses and now their grown children, some for half a century, they need a difference made in their lives too. We stand ready and willing to help the efforts of this committee on this issue, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Schwab, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Rowe, Congresswoman Brownlee, and members of the committee, I am pleased to be here today to offer the views of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation on the Department of Veterans Affairs Program of Comprehensive Assistance for Family Caregivers. I will simply refer to such program as the program in my testimony. The Elizabeth Dole Foundation's mission makes us uniquely qualified to share our views on this subject. We are the only national organization exclusively focused on the military and veteran caregiver population, the 5.5 million spouses, family members, and other loved ones caring for wounded, ill, or injured veterans at home. We call these caregivers America's hidden heroes, since much of their work is being done behind the scenes in the wee hours of the morning or late at night with little support or fanfare. Senator Elizabeth Dole, herself a caregiver to her husband Bob, started the foundation 6 years ago to shine a light on the work caregivers do each day and to advocate for their support. Mr. Chairman, our philosophy has always been to work hand in hand with the VA and other support organizations to determine what works for caregiver support and to provide honest feedback on what doesn't, ensuring that caregivers' needs are heard, programs are truly responsive, and that they are built to serve them as they serve their loved ones. With the passage of the Caregivers and Veterans Health Services Act of 2010 and the establishment of the Program of Comprehensive Assistance for Family Caregivers, the VA recognized caregivers for the invaluable work they do to assist in the rehabilitation and recovery of our nation's veterans. However, the implementation of the program has not been without its challenges, as been discussed. Congress initially intended the program to serve a small number of caregivers, those supporting only the most catastrophically wounded post-9/11 veterans. Upon executing the program, the VA realized that many more caregivers needed this kind of support than initially anticipated. As we've discussed, the program now serves more than 26,000 caregivers. That's nearly 3 times the number of caregivers for which the VA initially planned. Because of this, the program has faced significant challenges as it accommodates the growing number of veterans caregivers that qualify for the stipend program. Chief among these issues are unclear eligibility requirements, lack of accountability, and inconsistent implementation, which I expand upon in my written testimony. Despite these challenges, we know that this is an important program for caregivers, and we believe it should be available to all who need it, regardless of which era they served. We cannot let the pursuit of perfection delay us from doing what is right, and that is ensuring that vets of every era have access to this program. Mr. Chairman, Congress should act simultaneously to pass an expansion of the program to include service-connected illnesses and pre-9/11 caregivers, while also addressing the issues of standardization and clarity. These efforts should not be a zero-sum game. I'd like to leave you with a story that illustrates why programs like this are so important. Jenny Beller is from Indianapolis. Her husband Chuck was exposed to Agent Orange while serving in Vietnam in his 20s, and as a result, he had a stroke when he was in his late 50s. The stroke rendered Chuck paralyzed and unable to speak. As she grappled with her new reality as a caregiver, Jenny struggled with the demands of her job as a public attorney, while also slipping into debt. Jenny performs a juggling act that almost every caregiver around the country knows too well, and many of them are watching us today. She balances career, finances, Chuck's medical appointments, bathing, dressing, cooking, and cleaning, all while trying to fit in time for her own health and well-being. Jenny made the difficult decision to quit her job last year to care for Chuck full-time because, frankly, there is no one else out there better suited to do it. So I ask you to consider Jenny. She cares for a pre-9/11 veteran with a service-connected illness who was left paralyzed and without the ability to speak after a sudden and traumatic event. For 7 years, she has devoted all of her time to Chuck's care at the expense of her income and career as a civil servant, ensuring that he can receive the help in the dignity of his own home rather than in an institution. Yet as of today, Jenny is not eligible for the VA's program of comprehensive assistance. Isn't it our duty as stewards of those who have borne the battle to offer her the same support as those who care for veterans just returning from war? The answer is a resounding yes. As RAND's research points out, the #1 factor in a wounded warrior's recovery is a well-supported caregiver. And it is programs like this that are the lifeline for people like Jenny and Chuck. The program needs to be expanded. On behalf of Senator Elizabeth Dole and the Caregivers We Speak, I thank you again for the opportunity to be here today and to share our insights. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I'll start now by asking a few questions, and just one, Mr. Schwab, on Jenny you just referenced. Did she use any of the other VA programs that I've referenced to begin with? Has she sought those out?
I don't know in her particular case, but I know that there is an issue among many caregivers around clarity of eligibility for programs. The Secretary mentioned in his remarks that we've done a great deal of work across organizations and within the VA to put information out there in a more proactive way. So my hope is folks like Jenny are aware of benefits, but the issue is that Jenny still doesn't qualify herself for a program that post 9/11 veteran caregivers
I understand that. That's what this hearing is about. But my question is, is she aware? And I think one of the things when I hold veteran town halls around the country is getting access to information that programs that are there right now functioning for people. I just wonder if this, I mean, at least a dozen programs here that may help her right now. If she's not using it, I would certainly ask her to reach out to VA and see if she can't do that.
I appreciate. I just would like to say that they may very well be that Jenny is availing herself of certain programs, but I think the bottom line is still the unjust fact that Jenny doesn't qualify for support that post 9/11 caregivers do.
Okay, a couple of more questions that I have. Should the veterans and family caregivers live in the same residence? Should that be a criteria?
Is that a question for me?
Anybody, it doesn't matter.
I believe under the comprehensive program it is that they have to live with the veteran.
Have to live in the same
if they're not
residence.
The family member.
Okay, if they're not a family member. Family member could live outside and come in and help, a daughter or a son or someone.
Mr. Chairman, okay. if I could just add one, about a third of the nation's 5.5 million military caregivers are friends that live outside the home. So there's a significant portion of the population that in fact provide care who aren't in the residence.
One of the things, and this is the other support programs I was bringing up that are currently available, what are you all, and anyone can grab this, what are your views on the other programs such as adult daycare or veteran-directed home health care, and how should they fit in or complement the current program? And this is one of the things, as I was mentioning earlier, the way we provided non-VA health care was we had 6 ways, and then we added choice on top of that. Now we're trying to get one way we do that. Is that possible to consolidate some of these to make the services better?
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's actually a very good answer, and this is one thing that Secretary Shulkin had mentioned is the VA is doing very well at, actually better than is seen in other healthcare systems, because VA tends to take care of the veteran for their lifetime. They see the longitudinal need of that veteran. And so they provide a comprehensive array of services from primary care all the way to nursing home care. And in between all of that are these home and community-based services that you were just referencing. I do want to talk very briefly before we get into this about your question about caregivers knowing or not knowing about these services that you're referencing. The other thing that VA should be commended about is their desire to use literature, research, to inform their policy. And in fact, the research that they're doing on the Caregiver program, which we fully support, they found when they compared caregivers who are in the comprehensive program versus a caregiver who is not, is that those caregivers in the comprehensive program are far more aware of the benefits and services that VA has to offer. Mm-hmm. That's a key difference in the nuance between the two programs. Now, having said that, the availability of these services, as we all know from the Choice program, is variable because they are predominantly paid for, or I should say, bought by VA. They use community providers for homemaker home health aid, for respite, for adult day health care. And because of the variability of availability across the nation, so is the caregiver and the veteran's ability to access those services. It depends on where they live. It is no fault necessarily of VA or the private healthcare system. This is the nature of the market. So whether or not a caregiver is able to avail themselves of those services to support their veteran in their home depends on whether they are able to access that and where they live. So
I'd say a lot of that has, you've just mentioned a problem in the healthcare system, where it depends on where you live and access. As if you live in rural America, you're a lot less likely to have access to certain things than if you live in urban America. My time's expired. Ms. Brownlee, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is to Mr. Adesato. So we've, in these ongoing discussions around the current Caregivers program, we've frequently heard concerns about the possibility of duplication of services. And I wanted to know if you could share with us if you agree with that, or what's your opinion?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Congressman Brownlee. I have to disagree with the perception that there's a duplication of services. It may appear on paper that some of these services are doing the same thing, but when it's actually applied to a specific veteran, the patient, and the family caregiver, they are quite distinct. One of the key parts about the Caregiver program, the comprehensive Caregiver program, is that it integrates all these services. They have a support coordinator whose responsibility is to make sure that these needs, the caregiver and the veteran's needs, are met in an integrated fashion. When you're in a general caregiver program, it is not. So I want to make a distinction about that. And there was another comment earlier I would like to speak to on this particular topic. There was a discussion about a benefit called aid in attendance. That is a benefit, as was referenced, that is paid to the veteran, which is wholly distinct from the modest stipend a caregiver gets in the Caregiver program. That is paid to the caregiver. The reason why on paper this looks like a duplication of services is because it appears to be serving the same need. And the difference is this, Congressman. Aid in attendance benefit is a compensation to the veteran that is able to, as best as possible, distinguish a higher level of disability. When a veteran is 100% service-connected, like I'm sure past national commanders behind me are, versus somebody that is spinal cord injured at the neck level and is bound to a bed, they too are 100%, but their severity of need and disability is quite different. And what aid in attendance does is recognizes that greater severity of disability above and beyond 100%. And so I think what is most important here is that these services that Chairman Rowe had mentioned, the home and community-based services, the veteran-directed care, which is in our testimony and may have been discussed earlier, that these services be integrated in a sensible manner rather than fragmented, which does lend to waste and abuse. And so a comprehensive caregiver support program really fights against these fragmented services, integrate them in a smart way, and supporting the caregiver and the veteran at home.
Thank you. And Ms. Dean, do you have anything to add?
Only that to recognize the function of a caregiver in this program is within the directive says that they are supposed to be providing supports that exceed what would generally be expected from a spouse, et cetera. So they have agreed under the physician's plan that they will do X, Y, and Z that is required to keep this veteran at home. They are there to serve a function. They aren't there being paid to be a family member. They're doing work. The other thing is that the stipend is capped at the understanding of that they're only working a maximum of 40 hours a week. Now, we know that they probably are working a great deal more than that, but if they can manage perhaps only 40 hours a week, then they likely need to have a second job. And then that second job means that they're unable to do other things that maybe veteran-directed can then assist them with, like offering them respite care or coming in and shoveling the sidewalks or mowing the lawn or cleaning the gutters, doing things that they need that they can't possibly get to if they have a critical veteran that needs all their attention, or if they're trying to juggle jobs and care.
Thank you. And I have a limited time left, but I wanted to ask the question to the panel. So in your opinion, do you think current challenges that we've talked about today to the caregiver program prevent it from being expanded to include all ages, all eras? I have a feeling I know the answer, but you know, for the record, if you could just state your opinion.
So clearly, yes. So clearly, we believe that VA can improve this program and expand at the same time.
Very good. And could you also comment about whether you believe that veterans with severe post-traumatic stress benefit from the Caregiver program?
Absolutely.
Okay. But you don't see any barriers to that, right? In terms of that not being a qualifier for being a part of the program.
Well, it shouldn't be. It is now for post 9/11 veterans.
Correct.
So we hope to carry that on as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs had said earlier. The current eligibility criteria should be carried forward. I believe he wants to tighten up a little bit. The way we would like to reform the eligibility criteria is to include illness.
Thank you. That message was loud and clear. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Rutherford, you're recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schwab, on the eligibility issue, could you talk to whether you believe, for example, work outside the home by the veteran or the caregiver, whether that should impact on that eligibility?
I think that each situation for every caregiver is different. And as Meg Cabot mentioned earlier, there's a continuum of care, and there are caregivers all along that continuum. Some of the folks that I know that are in the program who spend 30 to 40 hours a week caring for their veteran have to work because they're the sole breadwinner for the family. And many of them are doing that through work-at-home programs. Hilton has a terrific work-at-home program that hires a lot of caregivers to be reservation agents. And so they're putting in double duty. Yeah. So yeah, there's a significant percentage of caregivers who need to do both.
Okay. That's kind of a good segue into my next question. Are you aware of any other government programs that the veterans could access to assist in this caregiver need that they have?
Well, Congressman, I think that's a great question. And the Secretary mentioned a new piece of legislation that the President just signed, the Raise Family Caregiver Act, which empowers the Secretary of HHS and actually requires the Secretary of HHS to bring an interagency strategy group together to begin to better organize across the federal government benefits for family caregivers and to enact and develop a national strategy for family caregivers. So I think we're going to see over the next year a great deal of attention across the federal government and among agencies to better organize those services and support and coordinate them for veterans and family caregivers.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Atizado?
Yes, sir.
I think that's kind of the point that you were making about the coordination of effort. And do you believe, and this is for all three members, do do you believe that there are offsets that we could find within VA through, better coordination and integration of some of these programs?
Ms. Rutherford, that's a great question, and I want to rephrase that question just a little bit. I think the discussion here today is about how to spend the resources that VA has smarter, so that you could use whatever is not used on other needs.
Right.
And so to that point, I think the caregiver program speaks to that. All of these home and community-based services speak to that. But one thing I want to make sure doesn't get past this committee is that because VA buys a lot of these home and community-based services, they require an authority to do that, which, as many of you know, is a temporary authority. The VA is now at risk of losing the ability to buy these services in the community because their provider agreement authority will cease to exist when the choice program terminates. Now, having said that, I want to point out that these integration of services is working already today, Mr. Rutherford. I believe we have somebody in our audience from another federal agency that VA has collaborated with to establish what's called a Veteran-Directed Care Program. That is a very strong partnership between CMS and VA. And what they do is they utilize expertise of both VA and CMS to deliver services in the veteran's home. And that is a great partnership, and it has shown to save money. In fact, there was a facility in, I want to say it's in Cleveland, that showed that they saved about $100,000 just on one patient alone, just for that one program. So the smarter use of resources, I think, is what we need to reframe our thinking about the cost of this program. It's a smarter use of resources.
Thank you. Any other comments? Thank you. And I see the Mr. Secretary is still here, so I want you all to know I look forward to working with you on those provider agreements so that we don't have that lapse. So, and with that, my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ms. Esther, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the three of you, and to the veterans and the caregivers you represent so ably, thank you. Thank you for your service and your passion and your tireless persistence so that we do better on this issue. I know several of your organizations have been working with me with the expansion legislation, and I do want to note both of the stories that you spoke of involve illness, and the bill that we have introduced would cover illness, and I think it's really important, Mr. Secretary, and I want to thank you for staying. And I think that's really important that you stayed, and I want to thank you. Not everybody in the committee could, but it's important that you hear from the VSOs as well, so thank you. But I think absolutely we have to figure out a way to include illness. It's simply unjust and unfair not to include illness. So I think we do need to do that. We're looking at, you heard the discussion about better use of resources, and that's critically important to meet those needs. There was discussion about the expansion, which I'm fully in favor of, to pre-9/11, where frankly many of those are hitting greater needs, escalating needs, not declining needs. And I do think we need to figure out some way to grapple with those two, as we've seen suicide rates going up of Vietnam-era veterans. People are experiencing now later in life different kinds of disabilities than perhaps they did earlier. So I think it is vitally important that we support families and help these wounded warriors. I'd like you each, the three of you, to comment on the Secretary's proposal that we try to concentrate that focus through some mechanism of, as he described, Tier 3, which certainly the folks you talked about would be Tier 3, and a cognitive component. Now, ideally, I think we would all want everyone to be fully covered in every respect, but trying to get your feedback as we try to find a way forward with the limited resources that we have. What would you want to see a cognitive component to cover? I'm assuming yes on illness would have to be part of that. Any Tier 3 would need illness and not just injury. I would be fighting, will be fighting hard for inclusion of illness, but can you talk a little bit about, given this population pool, what you'd advise us as we try to find a way forward?
Okay. Thanks for that question, Congresswoman, and for all your support. You've been a terrific supporter of caregivers. And I want to commend the Secretary, who's been on the record now several times that he's committed to expansion, and we work with him on a regular basis at the Dole Foundation, and he's just a terrific partner. Specifically on your question and the notion of starting with Tier 3, I think it's encouraging that we're beginning to talk about pursuing expansion. And I think it's really worth a thoughtful conversation and to explore a timeline on how we move beyond Tier 3 and make sure that all pre-9/11 caregivers who need and deserve support and this benefit receive it. So we'd want to have a thoughtful conversation around cognitive issues, and we think illnesses should be included, and I've said that on the record. So yeah, I think we're open to that thoughtful conversation.
We certainly won't oppose any efforts to expand in any way. And if starting with Tier 3 is what we have to do as a start, then we'll absolutely support that. I think I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that if there is a clinical need for a caregiver, whether it's 10 hours a week or not, that clinical need is still met. Because it's a service-connected need and it's clinically determined, it still has to be met at some point. So if we start with Tier 3, it just won't be the end of the conversation, but we'll support that.
Congressman Essie, first of all, I want to thank you for your bill and for championing the need to include illness and all pre-9/11 veterans into the caregiver program. And I would agree with my colleagues. For several years now, the DAV has been advocating for full expansion. And as we know, when we have such a lofty goal, incremental improvements is generally how things happen. So we are not averse to the Secretary's proposal, because I want to make sure that this committee is sensitive to this urgency of having to do this. Every day we have members who are passing away, and every day we have family caregivers who are impoverishing themselves and need help now. And so we're not lost on that. And so we want to move forward with this committee, not only with whatever proposal it is able to provide family caregivers this Congress, but to move that forward until everybody is equitably treated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, lady, for yielding. And I think no further questions. The panel is dismissed. I thank you very much for being here. It's been very helpful. And I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Ms. Brownlee, do you have any closing comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank everybody for being here. I think this has been a very, very productive hearing, and I hope that we can follow up with another hearing or something so that we can kind of roll up our sleeves and start working on some of the issues that are pretty clear that we need to work on. I just wanted to highlight and get on the record why the Secretary is here as well is, so these coordinators, social workers, I got some data to find out what the current ratios are to coordinator to veterans, and I just wanted to point out that in VISN 22 and several of their locations, that ratio is very, very high. In Los Angeles, it's 1 to 21. In San Diego, it's 1 to 123. Los Angeles is 1 to 121. San Diego is 1 to 123. Long Beach is 1 to 360. And Miss Esty in New Haven, it's 1 to 124. So we need some work given the existing program. I think in this hearing we've heard how important the coordinators are in terms of accessing service. So we really need to focus on that right away, please. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Jen, for yielding. And first, again, thank you all for being here. I agree with her. It's been an incredibly productive hearing. It helped me focus on what's possible. You know, it's rare that I say anything good about the press, but they actually, as I was walking back over here, gave me some ideas for a pay-for this, and a question that they gave me. There's some there's some possibilities there. I'd like to see us follow up with a roundtable. I found those very helpful, where we can just sit around and have a free flow of information, not in such a formal setting, and where we can hash out the details that the Secretary mentioned. And we asked the Secretary, would you provide us a framework of where you would like to see this go? I'd like to include the VSOs and our members, so that we can all be around that table and discuss that, along with any other people that would like to be there. And I think also it brings in, I'd sort of forgotten about this, it's put some urgency on in getting our choice bill passed so we can get these contracts done. Thanks for pointing that out again. And I think there is a way forward. There may not be a way forward to get everything everybody wants just because of the constraints we have now. We still haven't, after, what are we, 6 months on 5 months into the budget year, hammered out the caps for this year's budget. We're going to vote this afternoon again on a continuing resolution. So I began to see a way forward with this caregiver program for our post 9/11. I happen to be one of those. I see my Vietnam era brothers and sisters all the time at home. They explain this to me, so I certainly understand that. I appreciate, and let me just finish by saying how much I appreciate what the caregivers do and have done, as you said, in many cases for decades, not just a year or 5 years. In Senator Dole's case, and quite frankly, he, for me, is the epitome and a poster child. One of the true heroes I have is Senator Bob Dole. I have been in Washington, D.C. 9 years. I've asked for one autograph. It was his. And he's the only one I have. And there's a reason for that. To me, he is a true American hero. And his wife, Ms. Dole, also. So I thank you for bringing that up, being an advocate, and I look forward to continuing this work. And with that, the committee is adjourned.